Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now we welcome onto the show from Pro Football Focus, Austin Gale. What's going on, Austin?
Nothing much, man. How are you?
Oh, I'm just draft simming. We've just been draft simming pretty much nonstop because we're quarantined, and actually we would have been doing that anyway. But now that tomorrow is April, it's officially all on, pedal to the metal, draft simming, draft season, and so forth. So here is your first task on the show, Austin, is you have to grade our draft sims that we just did, okay? So I'm going to start off. I'm just going to tell you who I took for the Minnesota Vikings, and I want you to give me your reaction, all right? So I went with at 22, Javon Kinlaw, Jeff Gladney at 25, the cornerback from TCU, the Auburn corner whose name I can't possibly pronounce at 58. I got Damon Lewis from LSU at 89, and then at 105, Jeremy Chin, the safety from Southern Illinois. Grade my draft sim.
I actually really like that draft. I think the only thing that stands out for me is you didn't go after a receiver. I think this Vikings team definitely needs receiving talent in a draft class that's loaded with good wide receivers. It's interesting that you didn't go after him. However, I'm not going to knock a guy who goes after positional value. That name you can't pronounce is Noah Igbenogany, a guy I think who has some of the best upside in this draft class because of his athletic ability. I think him, Gladney, Kinlaw, those are all players that are very high on PFF's board. Then you throw Jeremy Chin and Damian Lewis, who I really do like Damian Lewis. I talked to him at the Combine. Nasty player. His comps are Gabe Jackson, a meaner version of Gabe Jackson. If that exists, I think that's a great pickup as well.
All right, let me just, before Courtney gives you her draft sim, I just want to explain the wide receiver thing is they all kind of went off the board for me, Austin. I could see this as something that happens is that everyone has hyped up this receiver draft so much that by the time we get to the end of the second round where they have the 58th pick, that a lot of the big names are gone. So I got to a point where I thought the Auburn corner who you pronounced, and I'm not going to try, he just seemed like the best player at that time as opposed to other receivers who were maybe the 12th, 13th, 14th receiver off the board at that point.
Yeah, I think if the Vikings are going to address the receiver position, I think it's got to be with one of those 2 first-round picks. I know they can find value on day 2, but they don't need a day 2 guy. They need a guy to come in and be a true number 1 alongside Adam Thielen. Now that Stephon Diggs is out of the picture, and I think at the back end of the first round, 22-25 range, you can get a guy like Denzel Mims, Jalen Reagor, Michael Pittman Jr., maybe T. Higgins. Like, that's where I start to feel like the Vikings would be comfortable taking a receiver in that spot because there will be a ton of value in that spot of the draft.
Okay, Courtney, now your draft sim.
Hi, Austin. So I engaged in some trading in my draft sim, which I've never
As
done
one
before.
Does.
I am trying to expand my expertise of draft simming because that's all Matthew and I do during the quarantine. And I decided I wanted to try to get as close to the top 10 as I could. So I sent my first round pick at 25, my second round pick, and my third round pick, the first of the two, to San Francisco, and I got their 13th overall pick in the first round. And what I did with that, I drafted Tristan Wirfs, the tackle from Iowa, with the thought that nothing's happening right now with Washington and the Trent Williams deal. And, at this point, the Vikings don't really have the finances unless they're able to move Anthony Harris, which to me, keeping him at safety right now seems like a need. So I drafted Tristan Wirfs from Iowa, 13th overall. I still had my first round pick at 22. I got T. Higgins out of Clemson. So there was a run on receivers. I ended up picking him at 22. With my third round pick, the second one that I got from the comp picks that came out a couple weeks ago, I got Troy Pride Jr., the cornerback out of Notre Dame. I know Mike Renner, one of your pals over at PFF, loves him. And ever since Senior Bowl, his stock has continued to rise. I've seen really good things about him. So I'd like to get him in the fold in the third round. And then my fourth round pick, I got an edge rusher, Jonathan Garvin, out of Miami, thinking that the Vikings could be in okay position to put a Fadio Denebo there, at least to start the season and create a rotation to replace Everson Griffin's production. How did I do?
I don't love this one as much, and I think I have to start with the trade, largely because with PFF and studying specifically draft trade analysis, a lot of the work that Dr. Eric Eager and another data scientist, George Jury, has done is looked at trading in the draft. And they say 9 times out of 10, if you trade up and don't grab a quarterback, you're not going to recoup that value for the picks that you gave up. So trading up for an offensive tackle, though, up there on the positional value chart, up there with wide receiver, cornerback, those things, it's going to be so difficult for Tristan Wirfs to be as valuable as the 2 or 3 players that you're giving up in that draft to trade up and grab him. So a little bit concerned there. But with Tristan Wirfs, a great player. Trading up for him, maybe he doesn't meet that value. After that, Troy Pride, in addition to Mike Renner, I do love that kid as well. I think some size concerns with him, but he's got track speed. He's a feisty player. I talked to him at the Senior Bowl. He's a very smart dude between the ears. I think he can play multiple positions in the NFL. I think that's a good pick on late day 2, early day 3. Jonathan Garvin, I think, will struggle to start in the NFL, but I do think he could be a depth player. He just doesn't have that next level athleticism to be a premier starting edge defender in the NFL. But in the 4th round, you're grabbing depth pieces. You're grabbing guys that could potentially be contributors down the road. I think you have to start, and going back to T. Higgins, I like T. Higgins in the 1st round. I think T. Higgins will surprise people with his athleticism and size combination. I think going after a receiver makes sense for the Vikings, as I told Matt.
Talking with Austin Gale from Pro Football Focus, does a tremendous podcast, 2-for-1 podcast with Mike Renner. Very fun podcast to listen to. And as I was flying out to the Combine, I was listening to that, just binging episodes on the flight to try and get my mind around what was going to happen in this draft. So you have been a tremendous help, Austin, for getting us prepared to analyze this Vikings draft. Now, as we talk about the different positions that they need, there are so many, Austin, that they can really go a number of different directions. But I think what we're going to find out, and I want to know your opinion on this, is whether they think they're trying to fill spots right away for 2020 because they still are pushing to be a competitive team, or whether they should be looking down the road. And I think drafting a tackle is sort of looking down the road a little bit because they still have Reef and Brian O'Neill. But drafting something like a safety in the 1st round, if they move Anthony Harris, that might be, we need to plug a position right away. I kind of feel like teams that try to plug positions right away get themselves in trouble. But how do you see that?
It's always that. I mean, drafting for need, regardless of where you are, in terms of the Super Bowl chase, often leads to negative results because you end up reaching at a position you feel like you need and not getting the results you need with that position to actually make that push. I mean, PFF has been at the forefront of this idea of draft for value, draft the best player available, sign need in free agency. And I think with that being said, the Vikings would be smart to take the best player available with the draft capital they have. I think they have enough needs and enough roster holes to where they can afford to really just take the best player available. Grabbing Javon Kinlaw and cornerback in the first 3 rounds is a smart decision for this Viking team because it matches need and it will match value at the spots that they're selecting. I think it does make sense for them to weigh both options, but if you find yourself forcing need at a certain position, say offensive tackle at the back end of round 1, and you grab like Ezra Cleveland at a Boise State, maybe you're reaching at that offensive tackle position. I think it might make more sense for you to go for a position that meets value and also offers some, obviously, immediate return.
So speaking of immediate return, let's say that they stick at 22 and 25. No trading allowed. So they end up having an option to get a receiver with one of those 1st-round picks, and let's say that they do with 22. At 25, would you look more closely at trying to find an edge rusher, a premium guy that could start day 1 and try to fill that production that you lose from Everson Griffin? Like, what to you is more important, keeping that pass rush where it's at, or trying to get a Christian Fulton, a Trayvon Diggs, any of those corners that would be available to you in the mid to late 1st round?
Yeah, my opinion is at the back end of the 1st round, where the Vikings are selecting, the 2 positions that will have the most value to them are wide receiver and cornerback. This is not a great edge class. After Chase Young, the drop-off is significant. You're looking for guys that are incomplete, won't deliver right out of the gate. And that's something that the Vikings don't necessarily need to force at this point. They can grab a wide receiver and cornerback in that spot, in that range from 20 to 35. Names that come to mind on the cornerback side, I think Jalen Johnson of Utah, Bryce Hall, Virginia, Trayvon Diggs, Alabama, all of those guys should be coming off the board between picks 25 and 50. And with that being said, go grab yourself a cornerback. Don't necessarily force edge defender in that slot because I just don't think the draft is a rich edge defender class. Go draft the guys that have a ton of value and also offer talent and those things.
Austin, receivers are really interesting here because it seems like even though it is a deep receiver draft, there's 3 that are above the rest in Judy and Lamb and Ruggs. But when we talk about the trade-up scenarios, is are they head and shoulders enough above other guys like Denzel Mims that the Vikings, let's say one of them drops to 16? You talk about those trade-up scenarios, but there's exceptions to every rule. Would it be worth it if they could get one of the top 3 receivers?
I'd argue no. I just don't see the value because it is a deep receiving class. Yes, those guys, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, and Henry Ruggs, are the upper echelon guys that are all ranked inside the top 10 on PFF's board, but you're still going to get a plus contributor to work opposite of Adam Thielen, where the Vikings are currently picking. Denzel Mims, Jalen Reagor, T. Higgins, Michael Pittman Jr., Brandon Ayuk of Arizona State. One of those guys is going to be on the board. And yes, they're not in the same tier as Lamb, Ruggs, and Jeudy, but they still offer high-end wide receiver 2, if not wide receiver 1 type of potential. I think the Vikings would be smart to go after Denzel Mims of Baylor. He has the size, has the athleticism. I call him the Julio Jones light. I mean, this guy has freakish raw ability, and I think it's on an expanded route tree. He can have a ton of success. We saw that at the Senior Bowl. He showed out at the Combine. If he's on the board at pick 22, I think the Vikings would be smart to pull the trigger because this guy's stock is rising with every day.
Somebody else's stock who seems to be rising, at least in recent mock drafts that we've seen, Todd McShay put one out today, Cynthia Freeland from NFL Network had one as well, is Justin Herbert. And I'm curious, like, how do you see the Tua and Herbert, I guess maybe the interchangeability of like where they get drafted if one goes ahead of the other that you might not be expecting. Where is his stock at currently from what you're hearing around the league? Because it seems like the interest that teams are having, at least right now, and they're obviously not able to get guys in for workouts, but does any of that hurt him? Or could maybe it help him because there still kind of is this mystique about him that we just don't know what he pans out to at this next level.
Yeah, I mean, to start with Tua Tagovailoa, I do think his stock is somewhat getting affected for the fact that these team doctors aren't able to come and check what's going on with his injury. And I think, yes, he's gotten approved by third-party doctors and those things, but teams are going to be hesitant to take him in the top 5 if they can't 100% confirm this guy's going to play it down in the NFL and doesn't have this significant injury risk. I think he still goes inside the top 5. It's going to be a bidding war to trade up and grab him between the Los Angeles Chargers and the Miami Dolphins, trying to trade up with the Detroit Lions. As for Justin Herbert, my opinion is, if the Jacksonville Jaguars, who feel like they're committed to Gardner Minshew, don't opt for Justin Herbert inside the top 10 at that 9th overall selection, I think you see him fall a bit. I don't think there are other teams that would want to pull the trigger. I think the Las Vegas Raiders get mentioned, but John Gruden and Justin Herbert aren't going to mesh. I've heard that a lot from others as well. It's just he doesn't have the same mindset, same competitive fire that John Gruden wants. He wants that out of Derek Carr, and he wants that out of his next quarterback. After that, I think maybe the floor for Justin Herbert is the 23rd overall pick to the New England Patriots. Yes, they have Jared Stidham, and they signed Brian Hoyer to a veteran deal, but they are willing to swing the bat on a quarterback. They're not in a position to think, we can't afford to do that. And I think at 23, either Justin Herbert or Jordan Love, depending on what Bill Belichick likes more, I think he pulls the trigger on one of those two names.
Now, Austin, if that is the case, that means the Vikings will have passed on either one. Would the Vikings be wise to draft Jordan Love or Justin Herbert if they get there? Even though they extended Kirk Cousins, it's usually a good idea to have some other option, and other teams have succeeded by drafting quarterbacks fairly high. Is it a crazy idea for the Vikings to take either one of those if they show up there?
I personally argue no, just because I do think the Vikings are trying to maximize this window with Kirk Cousins under contract and the roster they have in place. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, I don't think either of those two quarterbacks are worth it for a team that the Vikings are in a position the Vikings are in. They have Kirk Cousins. I think the Patriots are in a way different position. They're potentially tanking for Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields in 2021 with the quarterback situation they have. But Kirk Cousins, with the right supporting cast, can make a push in now what is an expanded playoff in the NFL. I think they're closer, way closer than the New England Patriots. And these quarterbacks, in my opinion, Justin Herbert and Jordan Love, just are good enough to swing the bat at that position where they're picking right now.
Is there any sort of value pick or maybe an early day 2 pick? Because you talked about the offensive line, and that's kind of my thought of, at least in my draft sim, of why I traded up to try to fix this as quickly as I possibly could, while also addressing the wide receiver need. Let's say, because Matthew and I were talking about this, just how difficult how much more responsibility and weight is going to be put on the Vikings offense with a potential shortened offseason program to try to get to that next step. And with an offensive line that, so far has only brought back 3 depth players and needs an upgrade at both interior, both guard spots, and still kind of a big question mark of what's going to happen at left tackle. Is there anybody as let's say a day 2 pick, assuming it's still going to be rounds 2 and 3, that you could see as a good fit in a short period of time with a truncated off season, knowing that, the rookie experience is just going to be different this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think top of day 2, I don't see a ton of value, and specifically in the interior offensive line class. I think top of day 2, if you wanted to grab an offensive tackle, the guy I mentioned that wouldn't be great in round 1, but would be fantastic in round 2 is Ezra Cleveland of Boise State. In that, second round conversation, I think he makes sense for the Minnesota Vikings. I also like late day 3, or late day 2, early day 3, Jonah Jackson, the former Rutgers guard that transferred to Ohio State this past season and really blew it up. Great in pass protection. Don't love what he does as a run blocker, but I do think he comes in and is immediately one of the better interior offensive linemen from a pass protection standpoint for the Vikings. And you mentioned earlier Damian Lewis. I do think Damian Lewis fits that system well. He's a mean dude who can play in the middle. He's good against the run and in pass protection, ranked inside the top 10 in PFF grade this past year. This is a good interior offensive line class when you start taking them off the board in round 3 and round 4. However, I don't see second-round type of players that have high impact in this class.